There is a specific kind of silence that arrives before you understand something has gone wrong. Not the silence of a quiet room, not the comfortable silence of a late night when everyone is asleep. The other kind, the silence that is the absence of something that was there a moment ago. The silence of a door that just stopped moving. The silence of a telephone that just went dead. The silence that arrives not because nothing is happening, but because something has just happened, and the world around you has not yet caught up with the information. You know this silence. You have felt it. Most of the time, it resolves. The sound comes back. The door was just the wind. The call dropped for a technical reason. And the silence breaks, and everything resets, and you go back to the version of your life where you live inside an explanation. The 10 people in tonight's accounts did not get that resolution. The silence arrived, and they sat inside it with full attention, which is the bravest and worst thing a person can do. And they looked at what the silence was pointing at, and what it was pointing at did not resolve into anything they could carry forward without cost. Tonight's 10 accounts are different from anything we have covered before on this channel. These are not the stories that circulate widely, not the ones that have been narrated on 10 channels and packaged into every Halloween compilation and retold around campfires until the edges are smooth from handling. These are the ones that existed quietly in professional reports, in private correspondence, in the careful language of people who need to stay credible in their work, and who therefore speak about what happened to them with the specific understatement of someone choosing every word as if the wrong one might close the door on being believed. A 911 dispatcher, a lighthouse keeper in Alaska, a taxidermist, a beekeeper in Kentucky, a forensic photographer, family in a house built in 1921, a railroad conductor, a cartographer, mortuary worker, a night shift nurse. 10 people doing the specific work they had chosen to do, inside the specific routines those choices created, in the moment before the silence arrived and pointed at something that none of those routines had prepared them for. I am going to tell you all 10 tonight, in the order I believe they should be told, from the one that disturbed me least to the one I have been sitting with longest. By the end, you will understand why I chose that order. You will also, I suspect, understand the silence differently than you did before we started. Welcome to True Terror Files Official. These are 10 rare true horror stories nobody has ever made a video about. Let's begin. Before we go into the first account, here is what is waiting for you tonight. Story 1 is called The Call from the Ashes, the account of a night shift 911 dispatcher named Cassidy Rowe, working the graveyard shift at a county emergency dispatch center in rural Ohio, who at 2:47 a.m. received an incoming call flagged by her system as originating from a landline at 4. Remington Cross, an address she recognized because it was in the county incident database as the site of a structure fire in 2003 that killed 2 people and reduced the building to foundation. A building that had not been rebuilt, had no power connection, had no telephone line, and from which no call could, by any technical mechanism anyone has since identified, have been made. Story 2 is the second lighthouse, the experience of a man named Eli Marsh, who took a position as the sole caretaker of a lighthouse station on a remote stretch of the Alaska coast, and who, on his 41st day of solo residency, observed from his lamp room a second lighthouse approximately 3 miles south on the same coastline, a lighthouse that appeared on none of the maritime authority charts for that section of coast, that was not registered in any Alaska Department of Transportation record, that he confirmed over the following 11 nights blinked in a pattern that 3 separate Morse code experts independently decoded as his full name. Story 3 is what was inside the deer, what a taxidermist named Walter Cross found when he opened a delivery crate containing a white-tailed deer sent for mounting from an address in northern Montana, a deer whose internal cavity, when Walter made his first incision, had been preserved using a chemical compound that the forensic laboratory he subsequently contacted confirmed had not existed commercially until 2019. Inside an animal whose stomach contents and biological markers indicated it had been dead since 2011, inside whose preserved chest cavity, Walter found a wallet, a compass, a water-damaged journal, and a wedding ring belonging to a hiker who had been reported missing and never found in that exact region of Montana in the summer of 2012. Story 4 is The Beekeeper's Messages, What Daniel Pruitt, third-generation beekeeper operating 52 hives on his family's land in Harlan County, Kentucky, witnessed beginning in September when his bees began clustering on the exterior of his number 7 hive not in the loose. Organic formations of swarming behavior, but in tight. Angular formations that his neighbor's 14-year-old daughter identified one evening as letters. Formations that spelled names. Names of people in Harlan County who, within 48 hours of the name appearing, died. Story 5 is the 47th case file. The realization that forensic photographer Nola Fentress arrived at after 6 years of crime scene documentation when she spread all 47 of her case file contact sheets across her kitchen table at midnight and confirmed that every single one of them, every scene, every location, every case contained in the background, at varying distances but always at the same position in the frame relative to the primary subject, a figure she did not recall placing there. A figure she did not recognize. A figure that in 47 separate photographs taken across 6 years was always slightly out of focus in the specific way of something positioned precisely at the boundary of a camera's depth of field by someone who knew exactly where that boundary was. Story 6 is The Basement Room, what the Calloway family found when they broke through a sealed brick wall during a renovation of the 1921 farmhouse they had purchased in rural Vermont, a room behind that wall containing, arranged on wooden shelving with the care of an archive rather than the chaos of storage, 47 years of dated newspaper clippings, school photographs, handwritten notes, and personal documents, all relating to a girl who matched their 9-year-old daughter in physical appearance with a specificity that a forensic document examiner later described as, and I am quoting from the examiner's report because the language is important, beyond the threshold of coincidence as a statistical category. Story 7 is the 3 a.m. boarding the experience of a veteran railroad conductor named August Hill, who on a Tuesday night in November was running the overnight freight and passenger route through western Pennsylvania when at the decommissioned Caldwell Junction stop, a stop that has had no platform, no staff, no active infrastructure, and no scheduled service since 1962, his train slowed, stopped, and 237 passengers boarded. Story 8 is The House on Every Map, the discovery made by a cartographic drafter named Simone Ward 6 years into her career at a geographic survey firm. When she overlaid a selection of her completed map drafts and observed that every one of them, regardless of the geographic region, scale, or commission, contained the same set of absolute geographic coordinates minus 38.9 N, 84.5 W, an identical small structure that she had not drawn, had no source reference for, and that upon physical investigation at those coordinates, she found to be the lot where her childhood home had stood before it was demolished in 1994. Story 9 is the music she couldn't have known what a mortuary preparation worker named Petra Vance discovered when she was processing the personal effects of a woman named Dorothy Kane, age 79, whose effects included a lacquered wooden music box with no manufacturer's mark, whose mechanism, when wound, played a melody that Petra found beautiful and specific and entirely unfamiliar. A melody she spent 3 weeks attempting to identify through music recognition software. Musicologists and archivists, without result. Until she requested and received the hospital's recorded documentation of Dorothy Kane's final hours and heard, in the last 11 minutes of audio before Dorothy's heart stopped, Dorothy humming every note of that melody perfectly, in the dark, alone, 6 days before the music box was found. In story 10, the one I have been sitting with longest, the one that asks the question I cannot answer. The account I would have left out of tonight if I thought I could justify doing so is room 1307. What happened to a night shift registered nurse named Clara Reed at a regional hospital in western Georgia, who at the end of her 6th month in the position noticed that room 1307, a room she walked past every shift, a room that existed in the physical corridor of the unit, a room with a door and a window and a bed visible through the glass, did not exist in the hospital's electronic medical record system, had no patient file assigned to it, had no physician orders, had no nursing notes, and whose existence, when she raised it with hospital administration, was met with a quality of careful redirection that she describes as the specific response of people who are aware of something and have made a decision not to engage with it. On the last night of her employment at that hospital, Clara entered for the first and only time, found a patient in the bed, and understood with a precision only available in the very worst moments of a human life exactly who that patient was. 10 stories. Let's go. Cassidy. Roe had been a 911 dispatcher for 11 years when the call came in. 11 years of the specific education that emergency dispatch provides, which is not the education of crisis so much as the education of pattern. The deep familiarity with how people sound when things are wrong, the subcategory of sounds that mean imminent danger versus the sounds of fear versus the sounds of confusion versus the sounds of someone calling 911 not because of an emergency, but because they have no other number to call. An education that operates below conscious awareness, and that Cassidy had come to trust the way a surgeon trusts the feedback in her hands. She was working the 2 a.m. to 8 a.m. shift at the Harwick County Emergency Dispatch Center, a shift she had chosen because of the specific quality of the night, the reduced volume, the different category of calls. The way the hours between 2 and 5 a.m. have their own atmosphere in a dispatch center that you either find oppressive or clarifying. And Cassidy found clarifying, had always found clarifying, which is why she had worked it for 8 of her 11 years. At 2:47 a.m., her console flagged an incoming call and she answered with the standard greeting, and the line was quiet, not dead, not a technical drop, quiet in the specific way of an open line with something at the other end. The low ambient noise of a room, or what her brain registered as a room, a quality of space in the silence rather than the flat silence of nothing, she said. "Is anyone there?" And the line remained quiet, and she was in the process of flagging it for a trace when a voice spoke, a woman's voice. Low and unhurried, not distressed in the clinical dispatch sense, but carrying something Cassidy has since described as a quality she cannot name, a register she had never encountered in 11 years of calls. A voice that sounded less like someone who needed help and more like someone in the middle of telling a fact. The voice gave an address for Remington Cross. Then it said something is here. Then the line went dead. Cassidy ran the standard protocol's trace request. Address lookup. Dispatch flag. and the address lookup is where the protocol stopped being standard. For Remington, Cross was in the county incident database as a structure fire from August 2003, in which the building had been fully destroyed and 2 occupants had died. The property had not been rebuilt. The county land records confirmed the lot was vacant. The utility records confirmed there had been no power or telephone service connection at that address since the fire. And the telephone company's records, which Cassidy obtained through proper channels the following morning, confirmed that no active landline was registered to or routed through that address, and that no call originating from a number associated with that location was technically possible on their infrastructure. The trace on the call returned a location flag for 4 Remington Cross, not a cell tower approximation. Not an ambiguous signal origin, a location traced to a physical address that had no physical telephone from which to place a call. Cassidy has submitted the documentation to 3 telecommunications engineers, one of whom told her carefully, and after a long pause, that what the records described was not technically possible, and that his assessment of what it meant was outside the scope of his professional evaluation. She is also, because she is an 11-year dispatch veteran who believes in complete documentation, submitted the audio of the call itself. The voice quality analysis returned, a finding that she has since decided is the most unsettling piece of paper she has ever held. The background ambient noise on the recording, the quality of space she heard in the silence, before the voice spoke, was analyzed by the audio team as consistent with the acoustic signature of an enclosed residential structure. A specific kind of room, a room with walls and a ceiling and a floor and the particular sound absorption of furniture and carpet and the accumulated material density of a home. A room, in other words, at an address that had no room. A room that had been ash for 23 years. She still works the 2 a.m. shift. She says the night hours have not changed for her in the way you might expect. She does not dread them, does not sit differently at her console, does not approach the hours between 2 and 5 a.m. with anything other than the clarifying focus she has always brought to them. She says the only change is this: when a call comes in at 2:47 a.m., and the line is quiet, and she asks, "Is anyone there?" There is now a half-second small, private, completely invisible to anyone watching her work, in which she is genuinely uncertain which answer she is hoping for. Eli Marsh had taken the caretaker position at the Covey Point Lighthouse station specifically, because of its isolation, not as an avoidance of something, but as a pursuit of it. The deliberate choosing of a life organized around a single, clear, unambiguous purpose, in a location where the surrounding environment was so absolute in its wildness that the smallness of human concern became not frightening, but restoring. He was 44 years old. A former maritime engineer who had spent 15 years working on vessels and who had developed over those 15 years the kind of relationship with open water that runs deeper than comfort or familiarity, something more like kinship, the recognition of a native element. The Covey Point posting was a solo residency, 1 caretaker. Maintenance and monitoring duties, resupply once every 6 weeks. A radio line to the mainland Maritime Authority office that he was expected to use for weather and safety reporting, and that he was otherwise free to use as he chose. He had chosen it knowing it would be quiet, and it was quiet, genuinely and completely quiet. And he had arrived in January and established his routines and worked his maintenance schedule and spent his evenings in the lamp room, watching the water, and found without surprise that this was exactly the life he had been working toward. On his 41st night, at approximately 1:15 a.m., he observed a light to the south. He had not observed any light to the south on the 40 previous nights. The southern coast from Covik Point was, according to every chart he had studied in preparation for the posting, uninhabited and unnavigated, a stretch of rocky shoreline with no structures and no reason for any vessel to approach closely. The light was not a vessel. It was fixed, elevated, consistent, exactly the character of a lighthouse beacon, and it was blinking. Eli was a maritime engineer. He read Morse code the way a reader reads text automatically and without effort. And he read the blink pattern of the light to the south within approximately 90 seconds, and then he sat for a long time in the lamp room without moving. The pattern was his name, his full name, first and middle and last, repeated in a consistent cycle with the spacing and timing of a deliberate transmission rather than a mechanical malfunction or an environmental effect on a signal source. He documented it, logged the time, the bearing, the decoded pattern, and went back to it the next night and the next and the next, for 11 consecutive nights. And on every one of those nights, the light was there at approximately the same time, and the pattern was the same. He called the Maritime Authority's regional office on the 4th night and scribed the bearing and asked for any information about a structure on that section of coastline. The coordinator on duty told him there were no registered structures, no active or inactive lighthouse stations, and no navigational infrastructure of any kind on that stretch. He provided the GPS bearing. The coordinator confirmed it showed open, uninhabited coastline with no recorded structures. Eli hired a boat on the next resupply visit and went south along the coast to the bearing he had logged. The coastline there was rocky and steep and uninhabited in exactly the way every chart indicated. There was no structure, no foundation, no remnant, no scar in the rock where something had been built and removed. There was nothing at the bearing that would explain a light. He was back at Covik Point for his 2nd year. He says he checks the southern horizon every night from the lamp room, not fearfully, not with dread, but with the specific attentiveness of a man who has learned that the landscape he thought he understood completely has more in it than the charts describe. Says the light has not reappeared since the 11th night. Says that is not the comfort it should be. He says the question he cannot resolve is not what the light was, but how it knew his name, specifically his full name, including the middle name that appears on no maritime authority documentation, on no professional record of any kind, a name known only to the small number of people who have known him intimately, a name that no signal produced by a mechanical lighthouse could have had any access to. A name that the light to the south used with the casual familiarity of something that had known him for a very long time before he arrived. Walter Cross had operated his taxidermy shop in Gallatin, Montana for 22 years when the crate arrived. And he had in those 22 years developed the calm, methodical approach to his work that long practice produces. Not indifference to it, but a settled familiarity that allowed him to work with precision and focus. And the deep satisfaction of a craftsman who has spent 2 decades mastering a difficult skill. He received delivery crates regularly, fauna sent from hunting operations and private clients across the northern Rockies, and his intake process was standardized. Check the paperwork. Confirm the species and condition. Photograph the delivery. Refrigerate if necessary. Begin work according to the client's specifications. The crate that arrived on a Tuesday morning in October was logged as containing 1 white-tailed deerbuck. Listed as taken in the Flathead River drainage area, sent from a client address in Whitefish. The paperwork was standard and the crate was standard, and Walter opened it and photographed the animal and confirmed it was a white-tailed deerbuck and began his initial incision on the ventral surface. The smell that came from the incision was wrong, not the smell of natural decomposition, which Walter knew with the intimacy of 2 decades of close work, but chemical in a way that stopped him, a sharp, specific, preservative smell that he associated with commercial embalming compounds rather than anything that should occur in an animal taken in the field. He widened the incision and confirmed what the smell had indicated. The internal cavity of the animal had been treated with a preservation compound, introduced not after death from the exterior, but apparently from the interior, a process he had never encountered and could not immediately explain. He set down his instruments and called the forensic biology laboratory at the State University, a contact he had used for species identification questions over the years, and described what he was looking at. The researcher he spoke to asked him to describe the compounds, properties as precisely as he could from the smell and visual appearance. Walter described them. There was a pause, and the researcher said the properties he was describing were consistent with a specific synthetic preservation. It's a compound that had not been commercially available until 2019, 7 years ago. Walter asked what the significance of that was. The researcher said it was significant because the stomach contents and tissue degradation markers, visible from Walter's description, placed the animal's death at approximately 11 to 12 years ago. Walter spread a sheet on his work table and continued. In the preserved cavity of an animal that had died 11 years ago were 4 objects: a nylon wallet, water damaged but intact; a baseplate compass of a model commonly used by backcountry hikers; a journal whose pages had fused from moisture but whose cover bore a name written in marker; and a tungsten wedding ring. He photographed all 4 objects and called the Flathead County Sheriff's Office. The name on the journal matched a missing persons report filed in the summer of 2012, a 34-year-old backcountry hiker named Paul Deaton, who had set out on a solo route through the Flathead drainage area in July of that year and had not returned and had not been found. Despite an extensive search involving ground teams and aircraft, the wedding ring was identified by Paul Deaton's wife, who was contacted by the sheriff's office as the ring she had placed on Paul's finger at their wedding in 2009, the ring he had worn every day of their marriage and that she had assumed was somewhere in the wilderness with the rest of him. The client address in Whitefish from the delivery paperwork was investigated. It does not exist. The street name is real, but the house number corresponds to a vacant lot. The hunting operation listed on the paperwork has no business registration in Montana or any adjacent state. No person has come forward to claim the mount or explain the delivery. Walter has continued operating his shop because the work is his and he is good at it, and it has been his life for 22 years. But he says his intake process has changed. He says he checks the paperwork twice now, says he does not fully know what he is checking for. Which is the most honest thing he can tell you about what the crate on that October morning took from him. Not his ease, not his willingness to work, not even his specific confidence in the standardness of a standard delivery, but the ability to be certain, which is a small and precise an entirely irreplaceable thing to lose. Daniel Pruitt was the 3rd generation of his family to keep bees on the same Harlan County land, and his relationship to the work was the particular kind that only inheritance produces, not something he had chosen rationally and not something he could have left. Without losing a part of himself that did not have a name, connection to the land and the colonies, and the specific rhythmic knowledge of when to act and when to wait, that his grandfather had begun transmitting to him when he was 4 years old, and that had continued transmitting through his father, and that now lived in him the way the land itself lived in him, as a native rather than an acquired thing. kept 52 hives across 6 acres, managed them with the careful attention of a man who understood that the colony was not a collection of insects, but a single organism distributed across thousands of bodies, and had spent 31 years observing that organism's behavior with the intimacy that 31 years of close work produces. He knew what his bees looked like when they were right, knew what they looked like when they were wrong. What they looked like beginning in early September of last year was something he did not have a category for. The behavior he first noticed was on hive number 7, a clustering on the exterior of the hive body, on the upper brood box face, that was denser and more angular than anything he had seen bees produce. A formation that looked, and he has said he rejected this interpretation for 3 days before he allowed himself to examine it directly, like letters. The first letter formation he documented was a grouping of bees on the hive face that his neighbor's 14-year-old daughter, who had come by to help with the fence repair, and who looked at hive 7 with the fresh eye of someone who had not spent 31 years developing an interpretive framework for what was normal, identified immediately and without suggestion as a name. The name was Harold Combs. Harold Combs was 67 years old, lived 4 miles east of Daniel's property, and had been a peripheral figure in Harlan County's social life for decades. Not a close friend of Daniel's, not a family member, but a known name in the specific way that everyone is a known name in a community of that size. Then 48 hours of the bee formation on hive 7, Harold Combs died of a cardiac event at his kitchen table. Daniel sat with this as a coincidence for 2 weeks and then saw another formation, different name. Different night, the same angular density on the same hive face, and sat with it as a second coincidence for the 39 hours before that person also died. He has documented 11 instances. He has shown the photographs to a commercial apiarist with 40 years of experience, who told him that the formations were unlike any natural swarming or clustering behavior in the literature and declined to offer a further assessment. He has shown them to a university entomologist who said the behavior was anomalous and requested samples and access to the hive for study. He is not granted access to the hive for reasons he has not fully articulated, and that, when pressed, he describes as a feeling that the hive is doing something that has a purpose, and that study would interrupt the purpose in a way he is not prepared to be responsible for. He says he checks hive 7 every evening at dusk. He says he has developed a protocol for when a name appears. He documents the formation, photographs it, and then goes home and sits quietly and does not contact the person the name belongs to, because he attempted to contact the second person to warn them. Let's do the obvious and decent thing. And the phone rang into voicemail, and the person was already dead, and he has not attempted it since. He says the decision not to warn people is the one he cannot make peace with, and the one he cannot see, and its alternative too, and the one that will, he is certain, stay with him for the rest of his life longer, and more specifically than any other thing he has ever done or failed to do. He says he does not know what the bees are. He says he knows what they are telling him. He says those are 2 different problems, and he can only be honest about one of them. Nola Fentress had been a forensic photographer for 6 years when she spread the contact sheets across her kitchen table. Not for any investigative purpose, not at the request of a supervisor or as part of a case review, but for a personal reason she has described as a compulsion she cannot fully explain. A gathering instinct that had been building in her for approximately 18 months, and that she finally obeyed on a Sunday night when she had the house to herself and the contact sheets from 6 years of case files, 47 of them, arranged chronologically on every flat surface her kitchen provided. She had been aware for approximately 18 months of a feeling she could not name, a peripheral awareness. It's not quite a sighting. More of a repeated sense that something in her photographs was not right in a way she could not specify. Not technically wrong, not improperly exposed or framed or processed, but wrong in the quiet way that a composition can contain an element that the eye slides over and the brain files without examining, and that accumulates over time into a feeling without a source. She was methodical by training and by temperament, and she applied that methodical quality to the contact sheets on her kitchen table, moving through them in order, case by case, examining each frame with the focus she brought to her professional work, looking not at the primary subjects, which she had examined exhaustively in each case, but at the backgrounds, the spaces behind the primary subject, the areas of the frame where the case content ended and the environment began. She found the figure in the third case file she examined. Background, left quadrant, approximately 12 feet behind the primary subject, standing at a specific angle, not facing the camera directly, but turned to approximately 3/4 profile. The posture of someone who is present in a space and aware of the camera without performing awareness of it. The figure was slightly out of focus in a way consistent with the depth of field settings she had used for the primary subject, which meant the figure was standing at exactly the distance from the camera where the focal plane ended. She moved to the next case file and found it again. Same position in the frame, same depth of field blur. It's different location, different case. It's different date. The same figure at the same relative position, as if placed by someone who knew exactly where the edge of her focal plane was. She went through all 47. The figure appeared in 47 out of 47 case files. She has had the photographs analyzed by 2 independent imaging specialists. Both confirmed the figure is not an artifact, not a processing error, not a lens anomaly. It is a physical presence in the frame at the time of exposure. Neither specialist was able to identify the figure from the available image quality, because the figure is always at the exact depth where her camera's sharpness ends, present enough to confirm existence, blurred enough to prevent identification. Nola has submitted a formal report to her department supervisor and to the State Forensic Imaging Board. She continues working because she is good at what she does, and because the alternative, stopping, is a form of answer she is not ready to give. She says the question that occupies her is not who the figure is, though that question occupies her significantly. She says the question that occupies her most is the focal plane, the specific technical fact that in 47 photographs taken across 6 years, with multiple different camera bodies and lens configurations, each image calibrated to a different primary subject, the figure is always, without exception, standing at exactly the point where her camera stops producing sharp images. She says that requires either an impossible coincidence of positioning or a knowledge of her camera settings that no one standing in a crime scene background should possess. She says she has now changed her focal plane calibration on every shoot, extending her depth of field as far as her equipment allows. She says the figure is still slightly out of focus. She says she does not know what that means. She says she is not certain she wants to. The Calloway family had purchased the 1921 farmhouse in Whitfield, Vermont, specifically because of its age, not because they were romantics about old houses exactly, but because Diane Calloway was an architectural historian and her husband Marcus was a restoration carpenter. And their 9-year-old daughter Lena had grown up understanding that old houses were the family business in the specific way that some children grow up, understanding that the family business is the most interesting thing in the world, and some grow up understanding that it is the most tedious, and Lena was firmly in the first category, had been from the time she was old enough to follow her parents through a renovation site and ask questions about the woodwork. The Whitfield farmhouse had been on the market for 7 years, which Diane had correctly identified as a combination of its condition and its price and its particular kind of rural isolation rather than any structural unsoundness. And she and Marcus had assessed it thoroughly before purchase and confirmed that the bones of it were sound and the work it needed was extensive, but not beyond what they had taken on before. They had been in the house for 4 months and working on the basement renovation for 6 weeks when Marcus found the wall. It was behind a section of shelving that the previous owners, or some previous owner from a period before anyone currently living had been in the house, had built directly against what appeared to be a rough-finished basement wall. When Marcus removed the shelving and examined the wall behind it, he found that it was not a finished wall at all, but a later addition. A layer of plaster over brick that had been applied at some point after the original construction, sealing off a section of the basement that did not appear on any of the building plans he had been able to obtain from the County Historical Society. He broke through carefully, because he was a restoration carpenter, and he broke through things carefully by nature. And behind the wall, he found a room approximately 8 feet by 12 feet, dry and intact, with a single bare bulb on a pull-chain ceiling fixture that was wired into the house's electrical system, and that when he pulled the chain worked. On the shelving that lined 3 walls of the room were 47 years of materials. Dated newspaper clippings, the earliest from 1977, the most recent from 2024, the year before the Callaways purchased the house, school photographs from a series of years, handwritten notes on index cards, report cards, a pressed flower, a child's drawing of a house with a family in front of it. All of it, every piece of it, pertaining to a girl. A specific girl, documented from apparent infancy through what appeared to be early adulthood. Physical characteristics consistent across the photographs. Dark hair, a specific quality to the eyes, a small scar on the chin visible in school photographs from multiple years. Diane stood in the room for a long time before she allowed the recognition to complete itself, because she is a methodical person and she wanted to be certain before she said it out loud. Then she called Lena downstairs and stood her in the room and held a school photograph from the shelves next to her daughter's face and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the comparison did not say more clearly. The girl in the archived materials matched Lena Calloway with a specificity. The hair, the eyes, the chin scar Lena had gotten at age 3 from a fall that the forensic document examiner they subsequently retained described in his written assessment as beyond statistical coincidence. The oldest materials in the room date to 1977. 48 years ago, 39 years before Lena was born. The Calloway family still lives in the farmhouse. Diane has cataloged every item in the room with the professional thoroughness of an architectural historian, because thorough documentation is the only response she has available to something she cannot otherwise process. Lena has been told the room exists. She has been told as honestly as her parents know how to tell her what it contains. She asked, with the particular directness of a 9-year-old who has grown up in old houses and understands that they hold things, whether the person who put the room together knew her. Diane said she didn't know. Lena thought about this for a moment and then said she thought they did, and went back upstairs to finish her homework. And Diane stood in the doorway of the sealed room and understood that her daughter's certainty was both the most unsettling and the most comforting thing she had ever heard, and that she could not untangle which quality of it was stronger. August Hill had been a railroad conductor for 29 years when it happened. 29 years of the overnight freight and passenger routes through Western Pennsylvania, a tenure long enough that the routes had become not geography, but biography. Every station and junction and mile marker carrying the accumulated weight of the years he had moved through them. The routes known to him the way your own neighborhood is known, not as information, but as the deep background of a life. He was not a man given to the dramatic. His colleagues described him consistently, when interviewed afterward, as methodical, dependable, and specifically uninterested in stories that could not be verified. A man who trusted what could be confirmed and set aside what couldn't without distress in either direction. The Tuesday night in question was in November. Cold and clear night with no weather complications. A routine run on a route he had worked 300 times. Caldwell Junction was a station stop on the route that appeared in his printed schedule as a historical notation. It was listed in the route documentation for record purposes, with a notation beside it indicating it had been permanently decommissioned in September of 1962 and that no service was to be rendered there. The physical infrastructure of the stop, the platform, the station building, had been removed, and what remained at the Caldwell Junction location was a stretch of track with no adjacent structure. No lighting, no personnel, no reason for a train to reduce speed in the night, let alone stop. August's train slowed at Caldwell Junction at 3:11 a.m. on a Tuesday in November, he has said. In the formal account he gave to the railroad company's safety investigation, and in the personal account he has since given to a small number of people he trusts, that he does not know why it slowed, that the controls did not reflect a manual input, and that the system log from that section of the route, which the investigation team reviewed, shows no commanded speed reduction, no track signal, no automated braking event. The train slowed and stopped at Caldwell Junction, and the platform doors opened. August walked the cars to understand what was happening, because walking the cars is what a conductor does when something is not understood. And what he found in the cars as he moved through them were passengers. He counted them because he is a methodical man who counts things. 237. Seated, quiet, dressed for the cold in clothing that August has described carefully as appropriate for November travel, not theatrical. Not costume, not anything he could identify as categorically wrong, except that it was wrong in a way he could feel more clearly than he could articulate. The way you can feel a room is slightly colder than it should be before you check the thermostat. He moved through the cars to the front, and the train resumed speed, and he stood at the front of the forward car and did not go back through the passenger section. At the next active station, Millfield Junction, he stopped the train and called the station master and reported that he had an unscheduled boarding and needed a full passenger count and documentation check. The station master and 2 staff members boarded and conducted the check. The cars were empty, not vacated between. Caldwell Junction and Millfield, the train had run express between those 2 points with no stops. Empty in the way a car is empty at the start of a run, seats undisturbed, overhead bins clear, no indication that 237 people had been sitting in them for any duration. The safety investigation found no mechanical explanation for the speed reduction and stop, found no record of any unauthorized personnel on the track, and produced a report that August describes as the most technically thorough document he has ever read about something that concluded with no conclusion. He retired 14 months after the incident, not immediately, not dramatically, but at the end of his 30th year, because 30 years felt like a complete thing, and he was ready for the routes to stop being his. He says the quality he cannot move past is not the boarding and not the empty cars. He says the quality he cannot move past is the passengers themselves, their quietness. Their specific quality of stillness, the particular way they were seated as he moved through the cars, faces forward, not speaking, not looking at him. In the specific posture of people who are accustomed to a journey and know how long it is, and are patient in the way of people who have already been waiting a very long time and have learned that patience is the only thing available to them. Simone Ward had spent 6 years at a geographic survey and cartographic drafting firm in Cincinnati. 6 years of producing accurate, technically rigorous map documents for government agencies, land development clients, and geographic research institutions. Work that required the kind of precision that does not tolerate approximation and the kind of systematic attention to source data that makes a good cartographer constitutionally allergic to anything that appears in a document without a verifiable source. She was, in the specific language of her field's quality standards, excellent. Her error rate across 6 years of drafting was the lowest in her department, and her work had been cited in 3 regional geographic surveys as reference quality material. She made the discovery on a Tuesday afternoon when she was cross-referencing a set of recent drafts for a consistency audit, a routine quality check process in which multiple maps covering adjacent regions are overlaid digitally to confirm that shared boundaries and geographic features are represented consistently across documents. She was working with a set of 9 maps covering different regions of the eastern United States, all produced by her team over the previous 18 months when she noticed the structure. A small building, residential in appearance, consistent across all 9 maps, appearing at the same absolute coordinates on every overlay, not in the same relative position within each map's frame, which would have suggested an overlay error, but at the same absolute geographic coordinates, 38.9 N, 84.5 W, a point in a suburban area outside Cincinnati. She checked the source data for each map. None of the 9 map source data sets, satellite imagery, survey records, prior cartographic documents contained a structure at those coordinates. The structure appeared in the finalized drafts, but not in any source material from which it could have been drawn. She checked her own drafting files for all 9 documents. She could not locate the point in the file at which she had added it. She investigated the coordinates. The physical location at 38.9 N, 84.5 W is a residential lot in a neighborhood she knew, the neighborhood where she grew up. The specific coordinates fall within the footprint of a house that was demolished in 1994 when Simone was 8 years old, and that she had grown up in from infancy to age 7. A house she remembers with the specific textures of earliest memory: the kitchen wallpaper, the back porch screen door, the quality of light in the upstairs hallway in the late afternoon. The structure she had drawn in 9 separate maps across 18 months. Things identical in footprint and external feature to the house as she remembered it. She has had all 9 drafts examined by 2 senior cartographers and by the firm's technical director. None of them have identified a point in the drafting process at which the structure was introduced in the technical director's assessment, delivered in writing, states that the structure's presence in the final documents cannot be accounted for by any standard drafting workflow error. Simone continues to work at the firm because the work is precise and meaningful, and she is good at it. She conducts her own quality audits on every draft before submission, examining each file for the presence of the structure at those coordinates. She has found it 3 more times in the year since the initial discovery. Always in drafts she has no memory of placing it in. Always at the same coordinates. Always in the identical form, the house as she remembers it, rendered in the clean. technical language of cartographic drafting, as precise and specific and apparently immovable as any geographic feature she has ever documented. She says she has considered the interpretation that she is placing it herself, unconsciously, as a form of grief or memory expression or some other psychological process she does not have a clinical name for, and that she has been unable to rule it out, which she finds neither reassuring nor disturbing, because both of those responses assume she knows which outcome she is hoping for, and she has realized that she does not. Petra Vance had worked in mortuary preparation for 14 years, not an occupation that most people encounter in conversation or think about in detail, which suited Petra, who is a private and focused person who had chosen the work because of its combination of technical precision and genuine service, the specific satisfaction of caring for people at the moment when care was most, completely beyond their own capacity to receive or acknowledge. She had developed over 14 years the professional equanimity that the work requires, the ability to move through it with respect and focus without the sustained emotional weight that would make the work impossible. And she was known in her field as someone with both the skill and the temperament to handle the full range of what the job presented. Dorothy Kane arrived in her preparation room on a Wednesday morning, a woman of 79, whose death certificate listed cardiac failure, whose family had arranged a traditional service, and whose personal effects arrived separately in a labeled box with the standard chain of custody documentation. Petra processed the effects according to standard procedure, cataloging each item, confirming the inventory against the family's itemized list, preparing the documentation for return. In the effects box, not on the family's itemized list, was a lacquered wooden box approximately 8 inches long, unmarked on the exterior, with a key already in the lock. She turned the key and the music box played. The mechanism was in excellent condition. The sound was clear and full, and the melody was complete. Not a partial fragment, but a whole and structured piece of music with an internal logic that indicated it had been composed. Rather than randomly assembled, a melody with a beginning and development and resolution, a piece of music that someone had written. Petra is not a musicologist, but she had studied piano for 12 years as a child, and she had enough musical education to recognize that she was hearing something specific and intentional, and to her ears, entirely unfamiliar. Over the following 3 weeks, she made 7 attempts to identify the melody through audio recognition software, music libraries, and 2 musicologists she contacted through the university music department. None produced an identification. The melody matched nothing in any accessible archive. On the 22nd day after Dorothy Kane's death, Petra requested the hospital's audio documentation from Dorothy's final admission. Hospitals in her state record ambient audio and palliative care rooms as part of their documentation protocol, recordings that are archived and available for clinical and administrative purposes. The recording from Dorothy Kane's room covered the final 27 hours of her life. Petra listened to the full recording. In the final 11 minutes before the monitoring equipment recorded cardiac cessation, Dorothy Kane, who had been recorded as non-responsive since the previous afternoon, hummed, quietly, steadily for 11 minutes in the dark of a palliative care room at 4 a.m. A dying woman hummed the melody from the music box, every note of it, in correct sequence, in the correct tempo, without error, as if she had known it for her entire life, or had been given it recently, and had spent whatever time she had left making sure she had it right before she went. Petra has the music box. The family confirmed when she described it to them that they did not know of its existence, that it was not in Dorothy's home when they cleared it, and that none of them recognized it. Petra has not been able to determine how it came to be in the effects box, whose contents were photographed and documented at the hospital before transfer. She plays the music box alone, sometimes in the evenings. She says it is still the most beautiful thing she has heard, which she finds strange, and that the beauty of it sits alongside the impossibility of it, without resolving into anything simpler than both things being true at once. She says she has made peace with the fact that she will not find a source for the melody. She says she has not made peace with the image of a woman humming in the dark at 4 a.m. alone near the end, getting every note right, and that she is not certain peace is the appropriate response to it, that she is, for the first time in 14 years of professional equanimity, glad. Clara Reed had been a registered nurse for 9 years, 5 at a large urban hospital, 4 at the regional facility in western Georgia, where the account takes place, and had accumulated in those 9 years the specific knowledge of institutional environments that nursing produces, the intimate familiarity with the physical and administrative architecture of a hospital that comes from moving through it at every hour, across years, knowing where the supply rooms are before you look, knowing which elevator runs slow, knowing the particular sound signature of each unit at 3 a.m. versus 7 a.m. versus 2 p.m., the building as a lived and embodied thing rather than a floor plan. She knew the 3rd floor of the East Wing the way she knew her own apartment, not as a map, but as a space with texture and history and the thick accumulated density of every shift she had worked in it. She noticed room 1307 at the end of her 3rd month at the facility, which was not when she first walked past it. She had walked past it from her first shift, but when she first looked at it directly, which is a different thing, the difference between peripheral awareness and active attention. And what prompted the active attention was the simple and entirely routine task of cross-referencing her patient list against the room numbers on her unit at the beginning of a shift. Room 1307 was not on her patient list. This was not remarkable. Not every room on a unit is occupied on every shift. What was remarked upon when she raised it gently and procedurally with the charge nurse was a quality of redirection she has since described at length. Not a direct answer, not an explanation of why the room was empty, or when it had last been occupied, or what its administrative status was, but a subject change executed with the smooth efficiency of something practiced, the charge nurse moving to the next item on the briefing with a naturalness that, in the moment, felt like normality and that, in retrospect, felt like training. Clara began checking the room in the electronic medical record system. Standard practice for a nurse confirming the status of every room on her unit. Room 1307 was not in the system. Not listed as unoccupied. Not listed as under maintenance. Not listed as administratively closed. Not listed, as if the room did not exist in the hospital's records while existing. Physically and entirely in the corridor of the hospital's 3rd floor East Wing. The door was real. The window was real. Through the window a bed was visible, and in the bed, on every shift, she worked for the following 3 months. As a patient, someone in the bed, the shape of a person under the covers. The stillness of someone asleep or resting, visible through the window glass in the specific way of a patient on a quiet shift. She raised the room's status with hospital administration on 3 separate occasions over those 3 months. The response was, each time, the quality of careful redirection she had encountered from the charge nurse, handled not dismissively, but with a specific, managed consistency that told her the room was known and the decision not to discuss it was deliberate. On the last night of her employment at that hospital, she had resigned for reasons she initially described as professional, reasons she later described more honestly as an accumulation of the specific weight of knowing something that no one around her would acknowledge. She tried the door to room 1307. It was unlocked. She went in. The room was a hospital room, bed, monitoring equipment, the institutional specificity of a space designed for a patient. The bed was occupied. The person in the bed was wearing a hospital gown, was connected to monitoring equipment, was lying in the position of someone in deep sleep or sedation. Clara stood at the foot of the bed and looked at the patient's face for the amount of time it took her to confirm what she had. She says, already known before she opened the door, known in the specific way you know things that you have been circling for months without allowing yourself to complete the approach. The patient in room 1307 was her, not someone who resembled her, not a person of similar appearance in the disorienting similarity of strangers. Her with the specific and absolute certainty of seeing your own face in a mirror, the face she had looked at every morning for 33 years. The scar on her left temple from a childhood fall, the particular way her mouth rests when she is fully at ease. Herself in a hospital bed, in a room that did not exist in any record, connected to equipment that was running and registering vitals on monitors that faced away from the door. She stood at the foot of that bed for a period of time she cannot accurately estimate. Then she left. She walked to the elevator, rode it to the lobby, handed in her badge, and left the building. She has not returned. She has not filed a formal report about what she saw, because she has considered the consequences of a formal report carefully and at length and has decided that the documentation of an experience that cannot be explained is a gift she is not prepared to give to an institution that spent 6 months pretending a room didn't exist. She works at a different hospital now, in a different city. She says she is a good nurse, and she intends to continue being one. She says she has checked on every shift at the new facility, that every room on her unit appears in the electronic record system, and that so far every room does. She says she will continue checking. She says the question she carries not with dread, she is careful to say not with dread, but with the specific and permanent attentiveness of someone who has seen something that permanently adjusts the calibration of their attention is not what the room was or why she was in it. She says the question she carries is simpler and harder than that. She says the question she carries is whether the patient in the bed was already there before she started working at that hospital, or whether the room was waiting for her specifically, and whether those two things, when you examine them carefully enough, are actually different questions at all. 10 accounts. And here's what I want to leave with you before we close tonight. Not a resolution, because there is no resolution available. Not a comfort, because comfort would be dishonest. But something that I believe is true and that I come back to every time I sit with accounts like the 10 we've covered. Every person in tonight's stories kept going. Cassidy still works the 2 a.m. shift. Eli is still at Covig Point. Still checking the southern horizon, Walter still takes deliveries and opens crates. Because the work is his, and 22 years of craft does not dissolve into a single October morning. Daniel still tends his hives every evening at dusk. Nola still photographs crime scenes, still extends her focal plane as far as her equipment allows. Diane Calloway is still in the Whitfield farmhouse with her husband and her daughter, in the room behind the wall, in the 47 years of evidence that something knew Lena before anyone else did. August retired at 30 years, which is a complete thing and a life's work and not a retreat. Simone still drafts maps and still audits her own files and still finds, occasionally, the house at the coordinates of her childhood. Petra still plays the music box sometimes, in the evenings, alone. And Clara Reed is a nurse in a new city, in a new hospital, and she checks her unit's room records every single shift, and she is good at her work, and she intends to continue. This is what true Terraphiles Official is built on. It's not the horror of the continuation, not the moment the silence arrives and points at something, what they do next. If you have made it here tonight, you are exactly the person this channel exists for. Subscribe if these stories are the ones you have been looking for. Comment below which of tonight's 10 are you still sitting with. We read every comment because we are a small channel, and every person here is a specific person who chose to spend 2 hours with us in the dark, and we do not take that lightly. Until then, check room 1307. Check every room. And if there is one that does not appear in any record, but that you can see clearly through the glass, look carefully at the person inside before you decide whether to open the door. This has been True Terraphiles Official. Good night.